Hey, well, hello, welcome to another Is There More to Life Than Netflix? And tonight we're going to be talking about what you can see just below me here, public shaming and racist tea. And we're not brought to you by PG Tips, but we will be talking about Yorkshire tea and PG Tips later, and whether a tea can be racist or anti-racist, we're going to find out. And all about this phenomenon of public shaming, which we think is something new. But before we get to that, my name's Dave. I am one of the leaders at Story House, which is a coffee shop and a church in Crosby, North Liverpool. And the coffee shop is closed right now, although we are starting to work towards reopening. So looking forward to that. But in the meantime, we're doing as much as we can online, which includes this. Is There More to Life Than Netflix? And what this is all about is giving you a chance to ask whatever questions you've got about life and faith and meaning and all of that kind of stuff. We're here for the curious and the skeptics and everyone in between. And we are a pair of Church of England certified vicars, believe it or not. So yeah, as I said, my name's Dave, and this is my wonderful friend, Andy Bond.
Dave, really good to be with you. I'm just slightly envying your setup there. I've got a pair of headphones and you seem to have a full radio studio in your living room, which is amazing. But yeah, no, if you haven't been around the last couple of weeks, my name's Andy. I'm helped to lead a church in Derby, a church called St Werburgh's, which is really great to be part of. And hopefully we'll be starting a new church out of the existing church in the next few weeks, maybe a month or two. So on the edge of Derby, which we're really excited about, and have lots of fun chatting with Dave and you guys over the last few weeks.
Awesome. Are you allowed to publicly say anything about that yet, or does that have to be hush hush for now?
It's kind of out in the open. The bishop's going to, we're just sorting final details really. But yes, it's kind of out in the open.
Yeah. Okay. So can you say where that is?
It's going to be a church called St Francis in Mackworth. So it's an estate on the edge of Derby. There's an existing congregation there who are faithful and they kind of kept things going, but we just really felt it'd be a great place to start something new and really try and connect with the estate. So there's a whole bunch of guys from our church who are going to come with us. We're going to move on there and we're going to start something new. And before COVID, we were going to start a new service, but obviously with all that going on, services are not happening. So we're going to be trying to do some online things, and we did a little litter pick with some guys on Saturday, which we didn't organise, but we just joined in with. And there's been a few kind of things in terms of food bank and provision and assistance, which we're trying to join in with that are already going on. So yeah, all sorts of things happening, and quite excited about what's going to be coming next.
Awesome, that's really cool. Great. So St Francis in Mackworth.
Yeah, that's right.
I did go right. And you've got, I believe, pages up on Instagram and Facebook if anyone wants to follow St Francis.
We do, yeah.
You're in the adventure. Awesome, that's great. As always tonight, we are going to invite you to put your comments and your questions below. Type into the comments, pop them up so that you can join in the discussion, because as amazingly interesting as we are, it's even more interesting to have your comments and questions thrown in. We had some great stuff last week, which was really, really helpful. Just throw your stuff in the comments and we'll bring you into that discussion. But what we're talking about this week is the phenomenon of public shaming that's going through a bit of a peak right now around certain kind of issues and things like that. But the one that kind of caught my attention, because I'm from the north of England, surrounds a cup of tea. So it appears that Yorkshire tea came out in support of Black Lives Matter. Someone on Twitter had some kind of issue with that, and so wanted to move over to PG Tips, at which point PG Tips jumped up and said, no, we're a part of Black Lives Matter as well. And it became this whole thing where like the T's were battling over like who had the supremacy of wokeness and who was like the most socially aware, which like personally I just found like massively funny, because it's tea. Because I remember the first time I saw this phenomenon was when I saw an advert on a tub of Ben and Jerry's, which was kind of like fighting for equal marriage. This was like somewhere between 5-10 years ago. And it just struck me as really weird that ice cream would have something to say about complex political issues. But it's kind of, we've entered this realm now where like literally everything has to be in one of the camps, one of two camps. And we see it like in kind of super adrenaline hyped up version in America where, you have to be in one of the two camps type thing. But I think there's plenty of tribalism going on around here. But this isn't a new phenomenon, is it, Andy? I think you've got a book there which tells us a little bit about where this came from, where it popped up.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny. So it was actually, I think it was a book that you recommended, Dave. I can't even remember when it was, but we were chatting one evening, quite a long time ago, and your wife, and you recommended this book, which is John Ronson, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And if you've not read it, it's an amazing book. It's not a Christian book. He's a journalist and writes a whole bunch of interesting things. But this book was about this kind of phenomenon of public shaming. So I think at the beginning he talks about the fact that, years gone by, there would have been people in stocks and would have been kind of dragged through streets, and there was a real thing around public shaming. And then for a number of years, in fact, I think he says 180. I don't know why 180, not 182 or 170, but obviously he's got it from somewhere. This kind of stopped, and then in the last few years, really. With the advent of Twitter, not the initial Twitter phase, but as Twitter began to kind of move on, we began to see this phenomenon of public shaming, where somebody would tweet something which was seen as wholly unacceptable and would suddenly go viral. And in the book, he basically goes and interviews a whole bunch of different people with stories. Some of them you'll have heard of, some of them you may not have heard of. I'd heard of some as I read them, and it's just a fascinating look at what's going on. So I guess what would be one of the examples, the kind of one that you might have heard of would be the example of a lady who tweeted a totally unacceptable joke about, she was on her way to Africa and it was to do with AIDS, and it was unacceptable, don't get me wrong. And she tweeted it just at the airport, and then she got on the plane. And I don't think she had very many followers at all. She just had a few hundred followers. And by the time she got off the plane, it had kind of trending worldwide. She had people meeting her at the airport, telling her to go back home. There were kind of threats and all sorts of things from a kind of an ill-timed, bad, offensive joke, but actually just a few hundred people. And it just went viral in a very, kind of not good way. I'm sure you read about that, Dave, and I think it's just very interesting to see. I don't know what thoughts you have about that.
Yeah, well, it's John Ronson's book was the first I read anything about public shaming. There's probably academics that beat him to the punch, but in a kind of popular reading level, I think he's the first person I know of who kind of latched onto this idea and this thing that public justice was back, essentially, like you said, it used to put people in the stocks and things like that, and it was happening again. And I think like that particular woman, because it's an actual thing that actually happened to someone, and I think, she didn't really talk to anyone about it, but John Ronson managed to get her to talk about it. The fact that, she had made this joke, which was poorly worded, came across as really racist. But interestingly, she was actually trying to make the opposite points. She was actually trying to make fun of those who do have racist views, but she just worded it so awfully that it came across like she was this massive racist. And literally because of modern technology, it just took the length of her flight when she didn't have signal for this entire storm to kick off and for her to lose her job, which is like phenomenal. She wasn't involved at all. She was in the air the whole time. And it just kind of beautifully illustrates what can happen right now, which is like, feels like the world is an ideas tinderbox, and like the moment you say something wrong, it just kind of all kicks off. There's no, the case with her is like there was no listening to what she might have meant. There was no like asking her questions. There was definitely no grace. There was no like waiting to hear. There was no, no chance for her to apologize or, say she had meant it to mean what she meant it to mean, and she was this like terribly, deeply racist person. There was, zero chance that she could get any better. It's like this very instant kind of judgment. And I think it's kind of escalated a bit from there. Like, it seems now if you are in the public spotlight for any kind of reason or got any kind of semi-significant job, if someone can dig up something stupid you said online from like 10, 15 years ago, then people do and have lost their jobs over things they said a long time ago. And, our generation, I've heard a few people say, like, we're just so grateful the internet wasn't as well developed when we were teenagers, because all the stupid things you say during that age, and like if it had been recorded and it was like public fact, like how much stuff could get thrown at us, like, comments that you just kind of pass by and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating about some of this is the speed at which things move. So there's the speed obviously at which things go viral, but there's also the speed at which things change from being acceptable to being unacceptable. I think again, there's all sorts of places we could go which would be very controversial, which probably are unwise. But I know in Douglas Murray talks about it in his book Madness of the Crowds, and he says actually that the language keeps changing, and actually what was acceptable 10 years ago is suddenly deemed unacceptable now, and so and it's completely beyond the pale, and yet it was a mainstream view just 10 years ago. And I think that makes it incredibly challenging. And you see this. I mean, I don't know. When we were growing up, there were terms that perhaps our parents or grandparents that would use, and you'd be like, "Oh, I can't believe you're saying that." That's incredibly offensive. And they'd be like, "But this was the term we used when we were growing up." And obviously, language does change, and it's right that we keep pace with that. But actually, the speed seems to grow. It seems only every year there's a new term that comes out that I've not heard of. I think 5 years ago, if you'd said the word woke, I would have never have heard of it. If you've and there's all kinds of other terminology which, again, not to jump into the racism thing, but people of color wouldn't have been a term that I would have known just a few years ago. And so that the pace of that change actually makes it quite hard to keep up. And although some people will use things offensively, sometimes it's just an ill-timed or just kind of ignorance, really, which again, almost like the rules of the game keep changing, and you can play a game online of constantly correcting one another. And it's right, that we're open to learn and things, and to the way things change. But I know Jonathan Haidt talks about this in which book is it? It's basically to do with the coddling of the American mind. And he says, actually, we need to look at people's intent, not just what's said. Actually, were people intending to be offensive? Or was it actually just kind of negligence or, bad timing or ignorance? And often I think there's ignorance going on, with particularly, Twitter's only however many characters, and it's easy to get things wrong. I think, oh my goodness, how often do I, am I grateful that I haven't tweeted something? And actually then it makes me not want to tweet something because I could inadvertently offend somebody, or, particularly as a churchman and vicar, you need to be aware of what you're saying. And what we're saying still carries some level of authority in some people's minds. Not everybody by any stretch, but some people do look up to vicars, and so you're going, oh my goodness, And in fact, John Watson says we're creating a culture where people feel constantly surveilled, where people are afraid to be themselves, and I think that's an interesting phenomenon in the midst of it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, isn't it? Because we live in a culture that says authenticity is everything, and actually it completely suppresses it. Like it cannot bear people living up to anything but a very exacting, like you say, very changing standard. And there's a real, I think, like hypocrisy in that, because if you think of like Little Britain, this week has been pulled from all the streaming services it was on. Just last week, and whether that's a good or a bad decision, and genuinely don't want to get into that because I haven't really looked at it, but whether that is a good or a bad decision, like the truth is, when that was first screened on the BBC not that long ago, it was one of their most popular programs. It was one of the most popular programs in Britain, and all of a sudden people are pretending like, oh, that was awful, and where are all the people that were watching it and it was completely fine when it came out, and it's like people have just like raised the bar so massively, perfection, and like I say, kind of changing the rules the whole time.
Yeah, and I think the change, obviously cultures always change, don't they, and language always changes. And I'm no history buff and I'm no language buff at all, but things do. You kind of read old school books and you're like, I struggle to understand it. But actually there's also something, isn't there, about where the culture we're living in, this idea of progress. People talk about being on the wrong side of history. People talk about all those sorts of, that things are, people use this word, don't we, progressive, as if things are progressing. And then C.S. Lewis would talk about chronological snobbery, the idea that actually, we're better, we're better than our ancestors. So we look back 100 years and we think, oh, they were stupid, or we look back and 500, oh, look at those horrendous opinions they had then. And in fact now we're looking back just 10 years and going, oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's incredibly intolerant and bigoted. And it makes you wonder, what in 10 years' time are we going to be? Let alone 100 years or 200 years or 500 years. What are they going to look back on us and go, oh, well, I can't believe that. And I think what's fascinating again is that it takes a very unusual person to kind of go against the grain, really. Kind of the people that would stand out to us would be people like William Wilberforce or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, so both quite famous Christians, one who campaigned for the abolition of slavery worldwide, or one who stood up to Nazi Germany in World War II. There was a German theologian, a pastor, but they very much went against the grain, and so therefore I wouldn't be confident in myself, knowing how I am and knowing my own heart, that actually would I be able to stand up against kind of current thinking or current thought? Am I sure I've got everything 100% right now? Blatant, I definitely haven't. There'll be things in the future. People are going to look back. I can't believe that, Andy and Dave didn't see that as wrong. Yeah.
No, completely. And I think it's like one of our favorites, Tim Keller, who unfortunately got
who's he? Never heard of it.
They got diagnosed with cancer this week. But I remember one of his quotes around this issue is that there will be things that you believe and say and do now that your children and grandchildren will find morally repugnant and offensive, and you don't know what those things are yet. Like, that's the thing. You're currently doing something that the next generation are going to find deeply offensive, and you don't know. But here's the weird thing about all of that is that these are surely like really noble, good aims, right? Like trying to make the world a better place, like, in terms of the anti-racism movement that's coming up right now, or whatever these issues might be, trying to make the world better for women, all these, they are really good aims, but they seem to be producing quite bad fruit, like, to put it in that kind of way. It feels like trying to do the right thing, but with the wrong tools, or, something like that.
Yeah. And I guess that there's a reality, isn't there, that, sometimes good things come about through kind of dodgy means, in terms of the way that things happen. But I guess there's also a thing, if we were to kind of go back to the life of Jesus at the time that he was kind of living, and we, if you've been around church much and you haven't been around church, then you may not have kind of come across them, but there were the Pharisees wandering around, who were kind of very committed, religious Jewish men who kind of knew the Jewish law, and they knew the scriptures really, really well, and they were desperate for a kind of a purifying movement within Judaism. They just thought, if we can just get pure, we can just obey the law. And actually, Jesus, interestingly, is his kind of harshest to the Pharisees. If we'd have lived at the time, we'd have thought the Pharisees were the best, and yet actually Jesus comes down on them really quite heavily, and so therefore their aim was kind of to purify the faith and to come back to the heart of it, but actually they end up becoming incredibly judgmental, and kind of Jesus talks about kind of adding to people's burdens, and kind of yoking them with things that are really too much. And I guess it's so easy, isn't it, that if all of us, well, you'd hope that most of us would have a desire for good, for justice, for kind of righteousness, whatever, quite Christian-y terms, but there would be a desire for those things. We want the world to be better. The problem is, I think, that very often when we do that, we can end up getting proud about it, we can end up getting arrogant about it, we end up pointing out other people's faults, because if we kind of raise a standard for ourselves, then we're like, oh yeah, but look at you down there who's not doing that. And I guess I think that's where grace has to come in, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was watching an interview with a Hollywood actor this week, who I didn't know anything about his kind of backstory. Honestly, it came from a mindless scrolling through YouTube moment.
Getting a lot of those during lockdown. It's funny. I don't know if you've been on, like, you're on Twitter and you get those clickbait kind of things, and people are like, I know he's got time to do that. And then some of the comments are like, everybody's got time to do that at the moment. Everybody's got time to go to those silly articles about 17 high school people and where are they now, or these are childhood stars. What are they doing in 2020? Like, everyone's got time to do that. So I think there's no shame, Dave. There, don't be ashamed.
Oh, well, thanks for not shaming me publicly on that one. I've been down that rabbit hole. Have you ever had that thing as well, where like you end up reading one of those articles or something, or watching one of those videos, and you're like, how did I get here? and then you actually try and trace it back, and you can't even remember like where to start. And every now and again, you do remember. You're like, oh yeah, it was that work I was supposed to be doing. But anyway, yeah. We've been there, we know it. Anyway, I got onto one of those random videos. It was his Dax Shepard is his name, married to Kristen Bell, and I didn't know much about the guy at all, but he's an actor in Hollywood, and he was talking about the fact that, you know, his life had been quite broken. He was addicted to drugs and alcohol to quite an extreme level, bottomed out multiple times in his life. And then he wasn't sure whether he wanted to be with and get married to Kristen Bell, who's like this kind of perfect looking person on the outside. And it was really interesting. He said like the reason he wasn't sure wasn't because he was like a dirtbag or whatever, but it was because she was a Christian, and, you know, if she saw a dog walking down the street without an owner, she would stop and pick it up and spend the whole day finding the owner. She let like 8 people live in her house rent free. You know, he thought she was paying the people who worked for her like way too much money, and he saw her as kind of like this person who's getting walked all over. But then he said, like, you know, over time, like, she never tried to judge him or shame him or change him at all. But he said, like, over time, he saw a way of life in her that just won him over. She realized that he realized that she was doing so much better in life than he was. And actually the things that she was doing that he thought were naive were actually creating a better world for her and the people around her as well. And it was actually like her way of living that way that kind of won people over. And it just kind of, it got me thinking to this Christian idea, if you're not familiar with it, of being salt and light. It comes from a teaching of Jesus. And it's this idea that the community of Jesus would be like this small but very distinctive and life-giving community within the broader community of the world, if you want to put it that way. That salt was the thing that back in the day stopped food from going bad, and you only needed a little bit of it, but it made a big difference. Same with light in a room as it is today. You turn on the light in a dark room and the whole room's lit up. And actually this way of engaging, which is to be this distinct, good, life-giving community that's supposed to be good for everyone else. And actually that is potentially, thinking about it now, this is just occurring to me, like maybe the opposite of public shaming. It's actually, you know, choosing not to judge and not to shame people, but live in such a way that hopefully the people around will be transformed and see, actually, that this might be a better way of living.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, dare I? So I guess there's,
you dare.
No, I'm just again thinking out loud. I mean, you know, I think Jordan Peterson, you know, love him or hate him, would say actually, look, you know, you kind of need to sort your own life out first. You know, kind of make your bed at home and kind of those sorts of things before you go and point out other people's stuff. And I think, you know, there's a sense, isn't there, that as Christians we would talk a lot about. Well, it's certainly in traditional Church of England churches, we'd have things like the confession, you know, which again, if you've kind of been to church, you come across, which is basically saying sorry. Not necessarily going into a box with a priest on one side and you on the other side, like you always get in films. I don't know why they always do it in films, you know, but it's just what it is. Yeah, that sense of saying sorry, and I think so often, and again, it's a bit cliche, but that whole thing about, you know, if you're pointing at somebody, you've got one, trying to do it, got one finger pointing at somebody else, you've got 3 fingers pointing back at you, and that sense of actually, you know, looking at our own failures and, you know, our own sin, our own brokenness, our own mess ups, and as we do that, and as we recognise how much we've messed up, actually, and then how much forgiveness we've received, it makes it much harder to then point at other people's. And you know, Jesus would talk, wouldn't he, about a kind of having a speck in your eye, having a log in your eye and a speck in somebody else's. Because I think there's always that human tendency for us to kind of focus on what everybody else is getting wrong. Whereas actually, if we're a community of people who are seeking to live out a Jesus-shaped life, that's attractive. I think that makes a huge difference.
And I think it's that thing as well, isn't it? We tend to attribute what other people do to who they are, whereas we kind of give ourselves excuses. So, you know, like, oh, they did that because they're lazy. but yeah, I couldn't possibly do that because I had 100 things on that day. Do you know what I mean? And it's that kind of thing of, and that's, I believe from the sociologists, that's the difference between guilt and shame. Shame is all about you are a bad person, and guilt is you did a bad thing. Personally, for ourselves, I am a bad person versus I did a bad thing. And it is very much like with the public shaming thing. It's like the moment you do something now, it's like you're a bad person group. I'm going to type angry things at you and all that kind of thing. And I think, it's worth mentioning, like, one of the things that kind of enables this is the anonymity of online. You can just shove whatever you want in the comments, no repercussions whatsoever, and then begins the flame war. Just a reminder that we would love you to pop your thoughts, comments, and questions in the comments box, including if there's anything you'd like us to discuss in the future. So, like, if you are curious about faith, meaning of life, or really skeptical, and there's something you would want to debate with us or talk through with us or ask us a question about, just pop it below, and we can either talk about it now if it's on topic, or if it's not, we will talk about it in a future episode. I've got one.
That would save us, Dave, wouldn't it, from trying to come up with a topic each week if somebody can come up with something for us?
Yeah, again, because lazy. So, like, if you can come up with something for us, that'd be wonderful. That'd be just so good. Got a good comment here from someone someone I know, the wonderful Rachel Bond.
I think you could call it a regular on the show, really.
Yeah, she is. Yeah, she's trying to get herself on here, I think, which would be great.
An upgrade.
Yeah. Well, definitely. Like, last week we had a great chat afterwards where Truth Telling Rach came out and she was dropping truth bombs left, right, and center.
Yeah,
we could just call her the truth. It'd be great. So anyway, Rach says, "Do you think the world has lost the art of the apology?" Awesome point.
Is she quoting that from somewhere? She put it in kind of little quotation marks. She got it from somewhere.
I don't know. It's single quotes. So it might just be like, I don't know,
a phrase.
Yeah. So
what do you think, Dave?
What do I think? I was trying to pass that to you.
You can pass it to me if you want.
Well, this is interesting. This brings to my mind the two types of people there are right now. There are basically those who are getting crushed because the moment you do something, you have to resign or leave your job or whatever. And then the other type of people who are Teflon coated people who just essentially are completely shame resistant, like shame bounces off them. And they're often actually, the people who do the most bad stuff. So I'm not going to kind of name names, but like there are certain public figures who get away with these awful things, and then it gets reported about, everyone talks about it, oh, you did this terrible thing, and they're just like, yeah, don't care. And I think actually John Ronson talks about it in his book, because Max Mosley was who used to F1. There was this big scandal about him being in this weird brothel situation, and it was all over the papers, and like everyone else who that had happened to, who got into the tabloid press for doing something awful, had been publicly shamed, was just like destroyed by it. But he wasn't at all, and so he went to interview about it, and essentially he came up to the conclusion that Max Mosley just doesn't care. And so for those people who just don't care, they keep doing their own thing, which is often morally questionable kind of stuff. Whereas actually, again, if we get back to the kind of biblical thing and the confession, all that kind of stuff, it's this different way again, which says, actually, I do stuff wrong, but I'm going to admit to that to another human being and to God, and in order to change and move on from that, which again is just not an option. And maybe when our culture was closer to its kind of Christian roots, like the apology was better known, and people got, politicians and public figures and things got used to the process of apologizing when they did something wrong. But to apologize now is to lose everything. It's to admit you were, in the bad camp and need punishing.
Yeah. I guess it reminds me of some of what we talked about last week a little bit in terms of the middle way. So it feels like to me you're saying, on the one hand, there are people who are basically, kind of oppressed and destroyed really sometimes. And genuinely, some people are destroyed. People lose jobs, they lose livelihoods, they lose relationships. From kind of relatively small transgressions. Like tweeting something which may be not good, but actually in the big scheme of things, they're not genocidal maniacs, and but actually it destroys their life in terms of what happens with the backlash. And so you've got those people, and on the other side you've got people like your Max Mosleys, who are quite bullish really, and just kind of almost Teflon coated. And then again, so you've got those two sides, and then you've got this third way, which isn't to deny what's happened, but actually is to kind of confess it, to say sorry. But it's not just the saying sorry. Then within kind of the Christian world, actually, the incredible thing is we believe that actually there's forgiveness. That actually we can be, we can take our stuff, our sin and our shame, take it to God, and we believe because Jesus, hung on a cross for us, took our sin and hung naked, took our shame, and then kind of took that on himself, and rose from the dead, that actually we can be forgiven. So there's somewhere for us to take sin and shame in a way which I think in a culture which has lost that, doesn't really, the options are, you either be kind of completely oppressed by it, or you just are really bullish. And I don't know what other option. I think, John Ronson's book doesn't leave that many options really. I mean, because it says, that your tweet lives on forever. There's no door, there's no way in. We don't offer any forgiveness. That is it. That those things are with you forever.
Yeah, no, completely. And someone else we know, Lizzie Lowry, also a fan. This lady on the Brené Brown podcast episode said, an apology followed by a but is no longer an apology. There's a lot of buts around, brackets, no pun intended. Love a good butt pun. So yeah, no, it's totally true, because it feels like to apologize now is to cede your ground. And it's like, if the whole world is the court of public opinion, and then you can't simply go, oh no, I was wrong, because then you're out of the game. You're down, you're in the social prison or whatever that thing is. So if you're trapped and you're like, oh yeah, I've done something wrong by the new social code, then you go, yeah, and that's your way back in, isn't it? It's your way back into the game to kind of keep your status. So again, it's working against this kind of Christian traditional thing of what we call repentance, confession, repentance, basically saying I messed up, I'm going to change, in kind of modern kind of parlance. And then Rach Bond having a guess at who I'm talking about. Not saying Rach, not saying who I'm talking cryptically about. It's actually more than one person. I can think of more than one person. And I think like one of the big differences that makes is internal difference as opposed to surface difference. So one of the things going on right now, and again, don't want to get into the rights and wrongs of it, pulling down statues of people who were involved in the slave trade. Again, that's another flame war online, which I don't want to get sidetracked into that specific issue. But one of the things that occurs to me from that, whether that is the right or the wrong thing to do, it's not really actually dealing with the root issues. It's not actually making anyone's lot better in life. Like any of those people whose life is, treated with less justice or less fairly, or is treated badly right now, is made any better by pulling a statue down. But it's big, it's public, it's showy, makes everyone who's doing it and involved feel very righteous and very kind of good about themselves. And I wonder, like we were talking about the Pharisees before, whether we just have a different form of Pharisee now, a different form of looking great on the outside that transforms very little about the inside of who we are.
Yeah. And I suppose the external is easy to measure, isn't it? I read an interesting article on the BBC earlier this week about a lady who's BAME, come under that banner, and she's a school teacher. I think she might even be a head teacher in a school in London, and she was getting quite angry really about saying, what people put on their social media isn't going to change anything. Come and help me educate people in East London, and I guess there's something, isn't there, that external things and social, and we hear, don't we, about virtue signaling and those things. It's easy to do something, but actually, and I'm not saying those things are wrong in and of themselves. I think it is right when there are issues that are significant that we do speak up, and we're called to speak up as Christians about those. But the danger is that that's where it stops for us, or it can be to align ourselves with current acceptabilities, or to go with the flow. And actually, Jesus spoke a lot about the heart, didn't he? Really, kind of, he said, you've heard it said, don't do this, but I say, even if you have that in your heart, then you're, he kind of raised the bar, and made it really hard. He spoke a lot about us kind of changing our hearts. He spoke about the Pharisees. One of the big Jesus insults, we were talking about this with the students actually on Tuesday, one of the Jesus insults, whitewashed tombs. We don't use that a lot these days. It's not an insult we use very often, one of those biblical insults with brood of vipers. Never heard that used down the pub. But the idea of a whitewashed tomb was that it looked amazing on the outside, painted white and amazing, but inside was a dead, rotting corpse. And he says to these guys who were incredibly religious, and kind of, well versed in the scriptures, and they were like whitewashed tombs. They looked incredible on the outside, but on the inside they were rotting. And I guess for us, for me, I'm aware, particularly as a church leader, it's very easy to almost walk down that road. I can tweet this, I can put this up on my Instagram, I can put that up on my Facebook, I can say the right things on stage. But actually, only Jesus really knows my heart, or perhaps my closest friends, and I think that's such a I think that's such a danger for us, really, in so many ways.
Oh yeah, no, massively. I think especially because we do a lot of stuff that is up front, like you're speaking at a thing and you're kind of expected to present a certain kind of persona, and not to ruin that, but I do plenty of stuff wrong, mess up on a regular kind of basis. And I think it is something that, again, to get back to the Jesus ideal, is something that he expected to include in the prayer that he taught, his famous prayer, like every day, to forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, kind of accepts like the human frailty and just how much we're likely to be messing up. And then also, how much we're supposed to forgive people who hurt us. And he says basically an indefinite number expects that people will be continually messing up against us as well. So yeah, once again, do pop your thoughts and comments below. What we're talking about is public shaming and racist tea, and can tea be anti-racist? Whoever really knows, but I found it funny to try. But anyway, to get back to something you're talking about before, this idea of like essentially like Jesus dealing with shame. I'm fishing for Sunday here because I'm going to be talking again. Have you ever heard someone talk in church using the framework of shame rather than maybe like sin and guilt?
I haven't. I'll be honest with you, Dave. I haven't a lot, and it reminds. And I think there's a cultural thing going on there. So I think in the West, we do kind of operate on a guilt. That's the sort of language and historically what we've done. But I understand that there are other parts of the world that do offer, operate much more kind of the further east you go. They do operate much more in a shame and honor culture. But, and I can't remember if it's John Ronson or Sam Chan, I think it might be Sam Chan, who talks about the fact that actually what he's seen, yes, it was in his book, he was talking about how to kind of talk about Jesus, but he said what he was seeing was that culture beginning to come more into the West. We're moving away from the idea of guilt, really. People don't like the idea of guilt, and I guess there's something there about believing that things are ultimately right and wrong. As we move away from that, and I think a lot of people have kind of moved away from ultimately, I don't like it, it's unpleasant, it's not my personal opinion, I wouldn't do it, it's not nice to people, it hurts people, but that doesn't mean it's ultimately wrong. I think we've moved to much more, I feel ashamed of that. And I think that resonates more closely perhaps with where many people are. But interestingly, I don't think we do talk about it a lot in church, really. I mean, I know, Brené talks a lot about it, and a lot of our friends rave about her. And I still need to read some of her stuff, or, your wife keeps continually saying, I'll probably say it later on, but I need to read some of it. Rach has read some as well. But yeah, in church, I don't know about you. I haven't heard many. Have you?
No, not at all. It just struck me before when you started talking about Jesus kind of dealing with shame as well as like guilt and sins like stuff, and I realized like pretty much every sermon I've heard kind of wraps up on the guilt bit or the sin, like the kind of I've objectively done something wrong, and there objectively needs to be something done with that. But actually, to think of it like in our current context, that actually Jesus could do something with the shame that we feel and that we experience. Could actually be more what people need to hear. Now, this is super putting you on the spot, but if you could put that into some kind of message, what do you think that would look like?
I think something I was reading just recently to do with shame was talking about how at the very beginning of the scriptures, we got this kind of story of Adam and Eve being naked and feeling no shame. And then as sin enters the world, there's a sense of separation from God, and they realize that they're naked. And there's this kind of sense, I think, of being ashamed, really. And I think, what's interesting is, that comes in at that point. And I think I always have this image of, I think for many of us, shame can sometimes be quite bodily, really, to not get too many images in people's minds. But I think a lot of people are ashamed, about their physical body, things they don't like. There is something about being, that's mixed in there. And so for me, I'll always remember, and I can't remember which preacher it was, but, was saying that, we always have these pictures of Jesus hanging on a cross with a nice little cloth covering him. But actually, in all likelihood, Jesus hung naked. And I do wonder whether there's something picking those things up there that, it was horrendous. The crucifixion would have been, that would have been in many senses the least of his worries, I guess, at that point. I don't want to speak, ill of that, but I think there's something in that Jesus takes that and then comes through the other side, that he would be something I think I need to think more about it, but I think that's how I perhaps would try and fit the things together. Jesus kind of sorts out he's the answer to that problem that happens right at the beginning of the scriptures as he hangs naked and then goes through that and then is resurrected from the dead and then appears in dazzling white, clothed in the new creation. I think there would be I think that would preach. I've never done it before, but I think you may have just inspired a future Easter sermon. I don't know.
Boom. There we go. Awesome. We've got a whole new set of Easter sermons. Awesome. I mean, something that just popped into my head as you were talking was the story of Jesus meets this woman at a well. And essentially that is a story about someone who had been publicly shamed. Like, this was a woman who was not kind of going out to the well to get her water at the time when she was meant to, because she couldn't mix with everyone because she had a bad history. And so she was essentially shunned from everyone. And as Jesus interacts with her, she ends up, in a sense, overcoming her shame. She goes running back to the village to come and bring everyone out to see Jesus. And that obviously goes so successfully that he spends, I think, a couple of days there or something like that, with all the people in this village. And so Jesus actually kind of, through his interaction with her, deals with her shame and restores her to the community, and restores the community in its as he does so as well.
Yeah, I think it's incredible, isn't it? Really, how often we see that in the gospel stories of Jesus. That yes, Jesus heals, kind of a physical problem, or he has a conversation, but actually often what you see at the end is people who are on the margins ending up kind of being re-put back into their community. Kind of go and be with your family. Those kind of things. People that would have never have been touched because they had a skin disease. Jesus places his hand on them. There's something more than a physical miracle going on, as important as that is, and I don't want to diminish that. I believe that happened, and those things happen, but there's more than that going on in those contexts, I think.
Yeah, there seems to be a communal healing that happens in those moments, which again, the people who've always fought for the healthiest forms of justice have always sought for some kind of reconciliation, healing of communities as well. Lizzie, thanks, Liz. Popping in another comment. Shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. And she is once again quoting her fave, Brené Brown.
Yeah, I do need to read some of her stuff. I'll be honest. I'll hold my hand up there.
Royalties to Brené Brown and Tim Keller. Like, start reading.
Yeah, indeed, that's right. Yeah, get some other people in there.
Yeah, and that's, again, like, if Jesus is offering this way that is different to public shaming and actually finds a way out of public shaming and healing within it, that has to involve change. That has to involve the people who are involved in the situation actually themselves changing. And again, public shaming does the opposite. It keeps people in their place, stops them from changing, which is ironic because the very thing it is purporting to try and achieve is social change, but it's doing it in a way that stops people from changing.
Yeah. And I guess that because I think I saw a tweet the other day by a church leader in the States who's in New York, and he's been quite vocal about everything that's going on. And he says, the world, something like the world has been better at justice and the church has been better at forgiveness. Maybe we can learn something from one another. And I suppose there's a danger, isn't there, in all of this, that it can make it sound like actually sometimes people hear forgiveness or they hear grace and they think you're kind of going, well, that stuff doesn't matter. Then you're kind of wiping away that, you're just kind of ignoring what occurred. And yet actually true forgiveness, true grace will result in a change in a person's life. And so I think, that actually Jesus wants us to live lives that look like him. And so it's not just going, that didn't matter. It's going, it mattered enough that Jesus died for us. But actually then Jesus doesn't want to leave us in that place. He wants to take us on and see change in those places. And I think, I think that's really powerful. And it's important to say, that although perhaps some of the things we've mentioned are relatively insignificant, there are sometimes public shamings for things that are horrendous. But actually, we believe there has to be redemption. There has to be a story that things can change, that things can get better, that person can be, that things can move on even for the worst. That's what I think our faith would speak into.
Yeah, and when we take forgiveness out of the private realm as something that helps me feel better about myself and into the public realm of something that actually is the tool to help heal the world. And you bring that forgiveness together with that justice, as that guy was saying, then that's the most powerful tool we'll actually possess in a moment like this to actually affect some meaningful change. It sounds shallow, but I was just thinking of in Hollywood films, their version of justice, think Batman or whatever, is use violence to get the bad guys and kill the bad guy or throw the bad guy in prison. That seems to be the only kind of justice we understand. But the biblical form of justice is much bigger. It looks for a healing of the whole world and communities brought back together and people isolated brought back into community. And that requires forgiveness of the people involved. I know we're both fans of the Alpha series, where you can explore Christian faith and discover more about it. And one of the weeks in that we talk about issues all around forgiveness, and it's always one of the most powerful weeks, I think. And the videos include stories of people having to forgive someone who killed their own parent or their own parents and family members. And it just seems impossible to us when we look at it from the outside, but it does actually happen, and it heals communities far better than anything else that I've ever seen.
Yeah, and I guess and it's easy to I suppose to pontificate on a podcast, but the danger that justice actually becomes about vengeance and revenge rather than genuine seeking of justice and long-term reconciliation and kind of redemption, really moving into a better place. It's so dangerous that we just end up at revenge and vengeance, I think.
Completely. Well, that feels like a good place to end it there, doesn't it?
I think so.
Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you for listening to us have our conversation that, as we said last week, we would be having anyway, just over Zoom or Skype or whatever, and we're just letting you sit in on it. If you would like to have your own question discussed, or there's something just around meaning of life, faith, and all that kind of stuff that you would like to be discussed and hear our thoughts on and join in the discussion, then just send a message through the Story House Facebook page or the website. We've got contact forms, both of those things. Get in touch, just send your question through, and as Andy said, saves us all the effort of thinking up an idea for ourselves for next week. And if you did enjoy it, hit the like button and share it if you know someone who might find this helpful. It's been great to be with you, and we will see you again next week. Thanks very much for joining.